I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 14. Piling On. 20th September 1990. CENTCOM Forward HQ, Military Technological College, Muscat, Oman. "Attention!" a non-commissioned officer said in a loud, commanding voice as General Schwarzkopf walked into the room. Stormin Norman, as he was known to his troops, was a bear of a man, but dearly loved by those that had served under him over the years. The briefing room was packed with commanders and key staff for this major briefing. The CENTCOM Forward headquarters had only been in Oman for the past 30 days. They were still in sorting things out mode as they got themselves brought up to speed. Figuring out what units were in country, what units were en route to country, what had been delivered and what was going to be needed for future operations was an enormous challenge. "All right, let's get started. I want to know what the Iraqis are up to, what we have on the ground that's combat effective, and what we have in the air," Stormin Norman said as he pulled out a chair and took a seat. "Morning, sir," said Brigadier General O'Donnell, the G2 for CENTCOM. Without waiting for an acknowledgement of his greeting, O'Donnell launched into his presentation. First slide. "Sir, this is a laydown of the Iraqi forces in the eastern provinces and the UAE. The slide showed the various Iraqi divisions, where they were located, and essentially what intelligence believed they were up to. The next couple of slides outlined what major ports were in the UAE and their status." O'Donnell paused long enough for Stormin Norman to study the map, then went on to explain, "We also have some indication that the 4th Al-Fau Infantry Division is moving to secure the port at Khor Fakkan, which is one of the few ports in the area capable of container offloading." "What about the port at Fujairah?" General Schwarzkopf interrupted. O'Donnell shook his head dismissively. "Sir, that port is strictly a petroleum terminal. They have no capability for containerization." Schwarzkopf furrowed his brow as he looked around the room. Notes were being taken, but he wanted to make sure the right notes were being taken. "Gentlemen, we need to keep this in mind when we go in. We're going to need both of those ports. They each have a needed function for sustaining our offensive." "Duly noted, sir," was all O'Donnell said before moving on. In the other parts of the UAE, we see the 6th Nebuchadnezzar Mechanized Division sitting tight on the edge of the empty quarter, and the 3rd Tawakkalna Mechanized Division reinforcing his positions around Al Ain. It appears that the 1st Hammurabi Armored Division will be the Republican Guard Reserve if needed. "Is this an opinion or fact?" General Schwarzkopf asked. "Opinion, sir," O'Donnell said without hesitation. "I think you're right. Let's plan on it being fact." "Sir, one other item of note. We've confirmed that 3 Scud launchers and missiles were offloaded in Sakr Port recently and have been deployed into the mountains. We have inserted 3 teams to find them and put them out of action with airstrikes as soon as they are located." As O'Donnell spoke, he pointed at the map of the suspected locations. "Good. I want them taken out as quickly as possible. Any indication the Iraqis have moved their chemical weapons?" "No, sir. All indications are that they have not touched their chemical weapon stockpile," O'Donnell responded. "Sir, do you have any other questions on the Eastern Front?" "Yes. I want to know more about these Iraqi Air Force pilots and squadrons. I find it incredibly hard to accept that they're this effective against our own guys. What's going on?" This was a question being asked by a lot of people. It had led to more than one speculative response. General O'Donnell appeared a little uncomfortable at the question, but looked to tackle it head-on. "Sir, there are some rumors that some of the Iraqi squadrons are actually being flown and operated by what appear to be contractors. Not actual soldiers, but private Russian contractors. Stormin Norman held up a hand to stop him right there. He'd heard the same rumors, but he wanted to operate on facts, not disinformation. I've heard the rumors too, but if these are contractors, where are they coming from? Who are they? Let's start to flesh that out a bit, because that's a really big deal. I agree, sir. We've tasked several of our intelligence groups with figuring this information out. We're also working with our embassy personnel in Moscow to see if they're hearing anything about contractors. What we know so far is the civilians appear to be former military pilots. I probably shouldn't say this, but one of my junior analysts said he believes these may in fact be Soviet pilots who have either temporarily or permanently left the Air Force to fly in these private squadrons. If that's the case, it would explain their effectiveness. Sir, if I may, General Schless said, interrupting. Schwarzkopf nodded for him to continue. If there are Soviet pilots in those fighters, they should be treated for what they are, mercenaries. Mercenaries are not afforded the protection of the Geneva Convention and never have been. We call them contractors today, but they are mercenaries. If we capture them, we should wring as much intelligence out of them as possible and then put them before a firing squad. That will make them think twice about volunteering for duty. Hold your horses there, General. We are not going to stand anyone up before a firing squad. Downed pilots, regardless of their nationality, will be treated as prisoners of war. First, I don't want to draw the Russians into this conflict, and shooting their volunteers might just do that. Second, we don't want to open the door to equal treatment to our downed pilots. No, let's get to the bottom of who these pilots are and then look at our options. Is that understood? Schwarzkopf asked, looking around the room for affirmative answers. Turning back to General O'Donnell, Okay, General, it sounds like this needs to be further vetted. So let's circle back to this when we have more information on it. In the meantime, let's talk Western Front. Sir, on the Western Front, the 2nd Republican Guard Corps has gone into a defensive posture on a line from Medina south. The combination of the 82nd, TAC Air, and 101st Attack Helicopters pretty much stopped him. However, coming down from the north is the 2nd Iraqi Corps with 3 divisions, the 7th, 37th, and 51st Infantry Divisions. The 2nd Infantry Division is sitting in Tabuk, and the 14th Mechanized is limping back towards Tabuk after the airstrike caught it in the mountains, O'Donnell said, pausing for a comment. None came. The 4th Iraqi Corps is sitting in the area of Bureda and not moving. The 9th Corps is in the Al-Hofuf area, with the 45th Infantry Division in Al-Jubail and the 49th Infantry Division in the Dammam area. We suspect that these 2 corps may be creating a second line of defense in the event of our counterattack. Fact or opinion? Schwarzkopf asked again. Wag at this point, sir, O'Donnell said with a smile. Might just be a good wild-ass guess if you ask me. Let's watch them, though. Moving over to the air campaign, we're achieving some air parity with the Iraqi Air Force. They're flying some of the latest Soviet fighters, which we didn't expect, and they've shown some very good combat tactics in some cases. We're still getting a higher kill ratio, but they have more aircraft in the region. Combine that with their enhanced air defense capabilities that we're seeing, again the latest in Soviet equipment, and our aircraft have taken a toll, O'Donnell indicated. Schwarzkopf turned to General Horner. How about coming by and let's discuss this separately? We've got to get air superiority, or at least total air parity, before we can launch any sort of ground operation. Yes, sir. I'll get on your schedule, General Horner said. Anything else, General? Schwarzkopf asked. Aside from the sinking of 2 Navy supply ships, the naval activity in the theater has been minimal. Primarily just the mining of the strait by both the Iraqis and Iranians. We're still looking for that submarine that sank our ships, but thus far nothing, O'Donnell concluded. Do the Iraqis or the Iranians actually have a sub? Schwarzkopf asked. On the Iraqi side, not that we're aware of, the Iranians recently received a Soviet Kilo-class diesel boat, which was located at Bandar Abbas. They have a limited capability in the Persian Gulf, but can operate in the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Oman, O'Donnell stated. Let's find that sub and keep track of it. Last thing we need is a carrier taking a fish or an LPH taking a hit, Schwarzkopf directed. Sir, that concludes my portion of this morning's brief. I will be followed by General Schless. General Schless was a West Point graduate. He was your typical career staff officer. He'd never commanded anything above the brigade level, but had held a few deputy positions and assistant division commander roles. He was fine working behind the scenes as opposed to being out front, taking shots for his decision. He was very comfortable making recommendations and doing the grunt work when it came to research. He just had no desire to be the one making final decisions. Morning, sir. Our current disposition of forces is as follows. The 16th Airborne Corps minus the 3rd Armored Cav Regiment and the 24th Infantry Division are ashore in Jeddah. Also in Jeddah are the 82nd Airborne Division, 101st Airborne Division, and 1st Corps support, as well as a battalion minus from the 11 Air Defense Artillery Brigade and a unit from the 7th Medical Command. The 24th Infantry Division personnel and equipment began arriving last week in Liwa and are moving into an encampment around the town of Fahud, which is to the south but keeps them separated from other forces we're flowing in at this time. Schless paused for a moment as he pointed at the map. The 197th Infantry Brigade's equipment is arriving in Az Sultan Qaboos Port this morning, and their people started arriving 2 days ago at the Muscat Airport. They're currently housed outside the city, waiting for their equipment and getting acclimated before we move them out to join the 24th Division, he said. The 1st Cavalry Division should be arriving the day after tomorrow, and the ships carrying their equipment arriving 3 days later. We need to examine where to locate them. Truthfully, sir, we're running out of room here in Oman. Agreed, but I want it understood they do not go any closer to the border. I do not want them seen from the border. Is that understood? Schwarzkopf said, looking at General Yosok, who nodded his head. What about the Marines? Schwarzkopf asked. Sir, the 1st and 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigades are ashore on Masaira Island and are beginning training for amphibious operations. They're going to be under the command of the 1st Marine Division. The 4th Marine Expeditionary Forces are afloat at this time. The 5th MEB is preparing to load and will be at sea in a week or so, as soon as the President gives the release. Once in theater, they and the 4th will be redesignated as the 2nd Marine Division. Good. They'll be playing a major role in this operation along the coasts. But first we need the sea lanes opened through the strait. What's our status on minesweepers? Schwarzkopf asked, looking at his naval staff officer, Rear Admiral Cochrane. Cochrane was a salty-looking individual with heavy folds and crow's feet around his eyes from being on deck in the sun too much over the years. He had a scar on his left cheek and reminded everyone of Captain Ahab from Moby Dick if he had a beard. His eyes, however, were ice blue and appeared to cut right through whoever he was talking with. Sir, we currently have 4 minesweepers in the region, with the USS Avenger being the newest. The others are older models, and to be truthful, we're having trouble keeping them in operation. The Navy hasn't given much thought over the years to countermine operations, and the ships show it. The best minesweeper force is the British. If we could get a couple of those guys... He didn't finish before General Schwarzkopf cut him off. Well, damn it, request them. If we don't ask, we'll never get them, Schwarzkopf said. What do we have to support operations right now as for naval forces? Sir, the carrier battle group Saratoga is on station in the Red Sea and the Kennedy in the Gulf of Oman. They're going to be joined soon by the Ranger, America, Roosevelt, and Midway. All are at some point en route or preparing to come in the very near future, Admiral Cochrane stated. Good. What about our amphibious forces? Schwarzkopf asked. The Persian Gulf Group and Amphib Group 3 are on station off Masira Island. We have on station 8 amphibious assault ships and 28 landing ships to support the operation. The Persian Gulf Group will have the battleships Missouri and the 4 minesweepers with the battleship Wisconsin steaming to join the group, Admiral Corcoran acknowledged. Between the Kennedy and the Saratoga, we have 4 squadrons of F-14 Tomcats, 2 squadrons of F-18 Hornets, 2 squadrons of A-7 Corsairs, 2 squadrons of A-6's Intruders, and 2 squadrons of E-2C Hawkeyes watching the skies. The 1st MEF will also have a wing of aircraft, which is currently located with the Marines on Masaira Island and the Sohar International Airport. "General, if I may," General Horner interrupted. "What is it?" Schwarzkopf asked. "Sir, one problem we're having is finding airfields for our forces. Oman is lacking really badly in that department. The Fahud Airport and Gaba Karn are single-runway paved airports with almost no support facilities. Deba Airport is nothing more than dirt strips. The Adam Air Base is part of the highway system, with no support facilities there. Muscat International is about the only modern airfield with support facilities that we can use. We have the 71st Squadron sitting over in Egypt, but we really have a need for some airfields here. Positioning all our Air Force assets at the Muscat International Airport is really putting all our eggs in one basket. Right now, I'm thinking we position our C-130 fleet at Fahud and Gaba Karn airfields. We can put some fighter aircraft at the airport in Salalah. Crews and maintenance people aren't going to be happy, but not much we can do about it at this point," General Horner went on to explain. "Do what you have to do, is all I can tell you," General Schwarzkopf said, not too sympathetic to the discomforts of the Air Force personnel. "I'd wager they'll have air-conditioned sleeping tentage up and running before the maintenance tents are up." "Gentlemen, I'm becoming more confident as we continue to build our forces, but we're going to need more if we have to dislodge Saddam from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. General Schless, let's prepare a request for the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Armored Division and 3 Corps Artillery. We're going to need someone to support those folks, so let's get 13th Corps Support Command as well. The 18th right now has the bulk of the attack helicopters, so request the 12th Combat Aviation Brigade and the 3rd Armored Division Aviation assets as well," Schwarzkopf directed. "I'd like to see if we could get 7th Corps to join us as well." "Sir, you realize that this request for additional forces, especially out of Germany, is going to ruffle some feathers," Schless pointed out. "What else do they have going on right now? The fight is here, so they should be here. Hell, this is just the first volley. By the time this thing goes down, half of the U.S. Army is going to be here," Schwarzkopf said. Chapter 15. Oval Office. 28th of September, 1990. White House, Washington, D.C. The sun was shaded in clouds on this late September afternoon as the president sat in the Oval Office working on a bill that Congress had sent over for his signature. The bill, the Crime Control Act of 1990, contained another rider, the Gun-Free School Zones Act. Questions about the constitutionality of the Gun-Free School Zones Act were being raised, and the president's advisors were sure that it would be challenged. He was of the opinion that it was an important piece of legislation and was strongly considering signing the bill. "Mr. President, Mr. Cheney, and Mr. Baker are here," the intercom squawked. "Send them in, please." The door opened, allowing his 2 most important cabinet secretaries to enter. As they did, another less-used door opened. A steward appeared carrying a tray with 3 coffee cups, a pitcher of coffee and sugar and cream. "How the hell does he know every time?" thought the president. The stewards always seemed to know just how many cups would be needed for each meeting he had, and approximately how many creams and sugars his guest would use. It was incredible the attention to such little details the White House staff put into things. "Thank you, Chief," he said, acknowledging the steward. "You're welcome, Mr. President," the steward responded, and left through the door he'd entered through. "Sit down, guys," the president said, motioning for them to take the couch while he took his single chair. After everyone had claimed their respective coffee cup and were seated, the president asked, "Okay, what have we got? Tell me Saddam has come to his senses after this UN resolution authorizing military force against him, and is going to pull out of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Mr. Cheney had a dour look on his face as he replied, "I'm afraid not, Mr. President. I would have thought that after it passed nearly a month ago, and the reality of it finally set in, he would have seen reason. Maybe come to an understanding that he wasn't going to be allowed to keep these nations. But it only seems to have caused him to dig his heels in further." "Damn." "We do have some good news, however," Mr. Baker chimed in. "Well, don't keep me in suspense. What is it?" the President asked, leaning forward in his chair. "General Schwarzkopf called and said that British forces have started arriving. The British 1st Armored Division, with their support elements, is starting to flow in-country, and the British Navy is en route with the Ark Royal serving as the flagship," Cheney explained optimistically. "That is good news, and Margaret said they're going to fully support us in ousting Saddam," the President responded, before sipping his coffee. "That's not all, Mr. President. I spoke to Mubarak again, and Egypt is sending 2 divisions. As we speak, they're moving to Port Said for embarkation, and they're opening up more airports for us to use. CENTCOM is working out where to send these new units and how we can best utilize these new air bases. We're thinking the Surtit Airborne Corps might be best served with the reinforcements. They've been in a hell of a fight there against 2 Iraqi corps, and holding their own, I might add," Mr. Baker said. "They've also sustained some horrific casualties, Jim. A lot of folks on Capitol Hill and the media are asking a lot of questions about why we aren't getting them more reinforcements or help," the President commented. Several journalists and a film crew were now embedded with the 82nd Airborne and the 101st, and the stories and images they were sending stateside were quite gruesome and sobering. Cheney bristled a little at the mere mention of the media. "It's being addressed, Mr. President. The reinforcement of the 82nd with the 101st has allowed us to hold the area. The air units we have in place, along with the helicopter support, will ensure we don't lose any further ground. This is a war. We're going to take casualties when we fight the enemy. But your help in getting Mubarak to back us and send forces to assist us helps to diffuse the argument the Soviets have been making that we're meddling in a regional dispute. Not all Arab nations agree with or welcome what Saddam has done. Many wonder if their nation is next." "You're right, Dick. I know you guys are doing all you can, and I'm glad Mubarak is proving to be a staunch ally. I thought he'd help, especially after Saddam humiliated him in the eyes of the rest of the Arab nations. Putting that aside, what do we know about these 2 divisions they're sending?" the President asked. "They'll be coming under the command of a Corps headquarters," Baker said, referring to his notes. "A Major General Ahmed Bilal will be bringing the 3rd Mechanized Division and the 4th Armored Division. General Bilal is en route to Muscat to meet with General Schwarzkopf and work out details of the integration of those divisions. We've worked with them in the past in the biannual Bright Star exercises, so we've got some good history working together," Baker went on to say. "That is good news. We're still staging aircraft out of Egypt, aren't we?" the President asked. "Yes, sir. We're now basing aircraft at Aswan International Airport, which has hardened aircraft bunkers and a squadron of Egyptian fighters. Hurghada International Airport, which has 2 runways and hardened bunkers. And Luxor International Airport, which also has 2 runways and hardened bunkers," Mr. Cheney explained. "What about using airfields in Oman?" asked the President. "Sir, Oman has only 1 or 2 satisfactory airfields for military use. The Muscat International Airport is one, Salalah is the other. The rest are pretty much 1-runway airfields with little to no support facilities. There are a couple of airfields in Saudi that haven't been overrun. Jeddah and Yanbu are 2, but they're well within Iraqi airstrike range and are frequently attacked. We'd rather keep our aircraft out of Iraq's range and use air-to-air refueling to bring them into the combat zone," Mr. Cheney explained. "How's the deployment of heavy equipment going?" the President inquired next. "It's going is about all I can say. We haven't done anything like this since World War II or Vietnam. I mean, We've had some exercises like Reforger that deployed forces to Europe, but nothing on this scale. Frankly, I'm surprised it's going as well as it is. Every day, it seems that the ship loading goes a bit better. Soon there'll be a ship every 50 miles from the east coast to Oman carrying our equipment and supplies, Cheney added. And the airflow? The president brought up next. Much better than the heavy equipment. The civilian air fleet has really stepped up and is moving troops from all over to the theater. The flight crews are volunteering and really taking care of the soldiers on those flights. This portion of the deployment started off good and has only gotten better. We've even let Aero Air back into the Civil Reserve Air Fleet. But we're keeping them restricted to cargo loads only, Mr. Cheney pointed out. Oh, why's that? Asked the president with a curious look. He didn't really know much about the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, other than that, when the country faced an immediate wartime emergency, many of America's commercial passenger planes could be quickly brought into the fleet to assist the Department of Defense in moving tens of thousands or even millions of soldiers across the globe. They were the ones that lost the plane in Gander that killed over 200 soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division after returning home from a 6-month deployment to the Sinai, Cheney elaborated. It was a terrible tragedy, and the worst loss of soldiers in peacetime in a single event. The president sat back in against the couch for a moment, thinking about something. Finally, he directed his question to Secretary Baker. Tell me about the Russians. What the hell is going on with them? This is tricky, Mr. President. On the face of it, the Russians aren't intervening in the war. However, as you know, the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency noted the massive Lend-Lease program the Soviets put in place with the Iraqis nearly a year before this war broke out. Since the war has started, the Soviets have continued to supply, support, and assist the Iraqis, Baker explained. A few weeks back at the UN, I pulled Foreign Minister Shevardnadze aside and showed him the images one of our keyhole satellites had taken of their naval base in Syria. I showed him images of vehicles, munitions, and other supplies being moved by rail or truck from Syria into Iraq. Heck, the Soviets are the only ones being allowed into the Gulf right now, and even there, we're seeing their freighters offloading supplies at the ports. I told him we knew what they were doing, and we're telling them it needs to stop. The president placed his cup of coffee down on the table, asking, "What did he say in response once you showed him the images?" He told me Iraq was a Soviet ally, and they were honoring some previously arranged trade deals. He said America doesn't get to dictate to the rest of the world who they can be friends with and who they can do business with, Jim said. Did you tell him that providing the Iraqis with material support that's being used directly against us, that's essentially them participating in the war? Cheney asked. I did. He said that they knew we had worked out a deal with the Saudis to collapse the price of oil in order to starve the Soviet Union of oil revenues. And he told me in no uncertain terms that America and the West had been engaged in unrestricted economic warfare against his nation for nearly a decade now. So no, they would not stop supporting their ally, Baker recounted. No one said anything for a moment. Cheney looked like he wanted to say something, but he seemed content to wait to see what the president would say to that. Finally, the president said, "Okay, I get it. Then let's look for ways to go after some of these logistical nodes that are being used to supply and support them." Bush turned to look at Cheney. "Maybe we can have some of our submarines and aircraft mine the ports in the Gulf they're using. I mean, if the Gulf is closed to traffic, then let's make sure it's unusable for them as well. Let's also see if we can't come up with some missions to bomb these logistical routes that the Soviets are using from Syria to Iraq and from Iran into Iraq. If they aren't going to stop supporting them, then let's do what we can to negate the support they're providing." Yes, Mr. President, I'll send the word down to the Air Force and the Navy to develop some target packages that address this issue. There is one other thing we need to discuss. Okay, out with it. I thought this was too cheery of a meeting, the president said with a sigh. Well, General Schwarzkopf has submitted a request for additional U.S. forces, and it's not a small number either. We've already run it by the staff earlier, and they recommend approval given what he's facing. But I can tell you there are reservations, especially from Colin, as some of what he's requested is coming out of Europe, Cheney explained. So, Jim, is this going to cause a problem with our European allies? Asked the president, as he took another sip of coffee. No, sir. Surprisingly, our allies are in support of what we're doing. All except the French, but they like to oppose us just for the sake of opposing us. I guess our European friends figure they would rather have us send troops before they're asked, or roped into sending troops of their own, Jim replied. Okay, so what is Schwarzkopf asking for? He's asking for the 1st Brigade of the 2nd Armored Division, which is located in Garlstad, Germany, plus 3 Corps Artillery, and the 13th Corps Support Command, which are at Fort Hood, Texas, as well as 12th Combat Aviation Brigade and the 3rd Armored Division, the last 2 being located in Germany as well, Cheney replied, as he briefly referenced his notepad. My God, does he want the kitchen sink too? This is a lot of soldiers. If we approve all this, will that give him the forces he needs? The president asked, a bit surprised at the size of the request. This must have been what Johnson thought when Westmoreland made his troop request in Vietnam. Mr. President, if we're going to get Saddam to move, we have to show a superior force. He's got to be convinced that we're serious and are going to drive him out of Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Putting in only a token force there will not convince him to move, especially with how well their units have fought against ours around Medina and how effective their air force has been thus far, Cheney pointed out. Well, what's his plan to move them out right now with what he has? Sir, I've asked for a ground offensive plan, but the response is always the same. We don't have the forces to go on the offense yet, Cheney said. Well, why don't we have the general get back here and brief us on his plans then? I don't like the idea of just giving him a blank check on this, the president countered. We can do that. That might be best. I'll talk to Powell and get a briefing set up for you and have them brief the proposed air campaign, as that's really in action now in the area around Jeddah and Yanbu, and the proposed offensive ground plan. Then we'll have a better assessment of the forces he needs. That sounds good. Let's do that as soon as we can. Get it on my calendar, the president said and stood, thinking the meeting was over. Sir, there's one more thing, and this is a bit unusual, Cheney said. The president resumed his seat. We've been short ships for the amphibious force. We only have 36 ships available, which, best guess, can move 2 Marine Expeditionary Brigades. If we could find more, that would be helpful. Well, where are you going to find some? The mothball fleets? Hell, it'll take 9 months to get those ships operational. Why the hell we keep them baffles me, the president said. Sir, several years ago we had a request from Evansville, Indiana, to acquire one of the old landing ship, tanks or LSTs, as that's the town where most of them were built for the war. They wanted a floating museum to the ships and the workers who built them, which at the time consisted of a large number of women, part of the whole Rosie the Riveter program. The ships were built there and then transited down the Ohio River until it linked up with the Mississippi. We granted their request, and they've maintained it and run it up and down the waterways, giving guided tours to schools, etc., Cheney was explaining. You mean they actually have a working ship? The president said with some surprise. Yes, sir. It's maintained by former naval personnel or workers on the original ships, or just veterans interested in maintaining history. They have a full crew as well, all civilians or military retirees, Cheney went on to explain. Damn, I'd like to visit that someday, the president expressed with a broad grin. Well, sir, you may get your wish very soon. They've contacted Admiral Kelso and want to have the ship rejoin the fleet with the current civilian crew. They claim she's fully operational and is standing by for duty, Cheney explained with a grin. Of course, we're not going to allow... He didn't get to finish before the president interjected. Why the hell not? What better way to show the people the support for this operation than to allow volunteers to join the force? What does Kelso say? The president stood and grinned like a kid with a new toy. Sir, the admiral said he would have to put a Navy crew on board and give it a full inspection, Cheney answered. Bullshit. We have civilian crews on the military sea transport ships, don't we? That crew is now, effective immediately, part of the military sea transport system. Tell Kelso to get an inspection team over there and give that ship a once-over. If it's good, then get it moving. In fact, tell Kelso to put an inspection team on board and move the ship immediately to New Orleans for deployment. What's the name of the ship? The president wanted to know. Sir, LSTs were seldom named. They were numbered instead. She's the LST-325. Today they call her the USS Memorial, Cheney said, in a bit of shock at how fast that decision had been made. Well, she's named and recommissioned. The USS Memorial sails again, the president declared as he picked up the phone to connect him with the White House switchboard. Yes, get me the mayor of Evansville, Indiana on the phone. I have a ship commissioning ceremony to attend. Chapter 16. Early October. 2nd October 1990. CENTCOM Forward HQ. Military Technological College, Muscat, Oman. Sir, General Powell is on the STU, Schwarzkopf's secretary said as he pointed to the secured telephone on the general's desk. Schwarzkopf lifted an eyebrow at that. He hadn't expected a call from Powell. He picked up the receiver. Colin, Norm here. How's the weather in D.C.? And don't tell me it's too cold, Schwarzkopf joked. It's fine, Norm. I'm calling about the situation over there. The president would like someone to come here and brief him on the planned air campaign. I've looked over what you sent, and it looks outstanding. I've been talking it up with him and the staff, and he'd like to get a full-blown brief. Chuck Horner and Buster Glosson have done a great job putting this together. I want you to send the team back with the air campaign, Powell explained. After a short pause, he added, and I also want you to send an offensive option back. Immediately, Schwarzkopf objected. Look, I've told everybody all along, we do not have the forces on the ground to conduct an offensive option, and if we do conduct it, there's only one possibility, and that's a penetration right to the heartland of the UAE, where we will sit. If the Iraqis choose to reinforce, we're out of options, we have no reserve, we have no other forces over here, and we could just as easily be destroyed. Powell retorted, I understand that, and you've made your position clear. What you're going to do is present an offensive option for the president and show the White House exactly what it is we're dealing with. Once they see that, it'll add validity and credibility to your request for those forces in Germany. Right now, you're just sending massive troop requests along with no plan of action for how you're going to use them. That's not going to fly. Furthermore, the 16th Airborne Corps is getting the shit kicked out of them, and you keep pushing for more soldiers in Oman while ignoring the battle you already have going. Schwarzkopf knew Powell was under a lot of pressure over what was transpiring here. Still, it stung to hear his comments. Reluctantly, he agreed. All right, I'll fly over tomorrow and present the briefing myself. I can... Interrupting, Powell said, That's not going to work. If you show up, it will be all over the nightly news. We can't keep anything secret around you. Send someone else to do the brief. You aren't trying to make this easy on me, are you? Schwarzkopf said, pausing for a moment. Suppose I send my chief of staff, Bob Johnson, to give the brief. Will that work? And when are we looking at doing this? It's on the president's calendar for the 6th of this month, Powell said. I look forward to seeing it. Have a good day, Norman. Then the call ended, leaving Schwarzkopf to stew on the news. This was not something he wanted to deal with on top of everything else that was going on. Bob Johnson had just finished going over the briefing with General Schwarzkopf for this October 6th meeting at the White House. The brief was short and direct, used a lot of maps, and presented the gravity of what they were facing. Major General Bob Johnson was a U.S. Marine officer who had joined the CENTCOM staff in early June and developed a great working relationship with Stormin Norman just before everything had kicked off in the region. CENTCOM, by all accounts, had largely been a backwater combatant command when compared to the three major theaters of operation: Europe, facing down the Soviets and the Warsaw Pact; the Pacific, dealing with the Soviet Pacific Fleet and the Koreas; and Central and South America, dealing with the narcos and the continued Soviet meddling. Johnson was a unique Marine officer. He'd been born in Edinburgh, Scotland, migrating to the U.S. in the mid-1950s as a teenager when his family had left the UK. Despite his 30-plus years in America, he still maintained his Scottish accent. During his time in the Corps, he'd had all the usual assignments for a Marine officer, as well as a few plum assignments. But CENTCOM was looking to be his final assignment. Schwarzkopf nodded in approval at the end of the brief. "Excellent job, Bob. Do it just like that when you're at the White House," he complimented, handing 2 slides back to him with some notes scribbled on them. "These are the last 2 charts I want you to show the President. They're the only offensive option we can launch right now given the forces we have. But I do not recommend this course of action. It's my opinion that this is the wrong course to take. If and when we go on the offensive, we want it to be fierce and with a force large enough to crush the opposition. This will likely force the enemy to give up or surrender en masse." General Johnson looked at the first slide and then the second before reading it out loud. "This plan is not recommended, and if you do want to eject the Iraqis out of Kuwait, it will take considerably more force on the ground that we presently have." When he finished reading it, he looked up at General Schwarzkopf. "Sir, you really want me to show this?" he asked. "Stick to this brief, though don't overemphasize it, otherwise I'll terminate your military career," Schwarzkopf said, half joking, half serious. "There are going to be bureaucrats at the briefing that have no military experience, but plenty of opinions that they will attempt to dazzle the President with. He needs to hear my position plainly. You're there to impart my opinion and not make any decisions or changes. Clear?" "Very clear, sir." Continuing, Schwarzkopf said, "When you brief this, you are going to be interrupted and questioned. Stick to the script. As you get into it, you're going to be dodging bullets from all sides of the room. Chances are, by the end, the room will be screaming that this is a terrible plan, and that is exactly what we want them to think. We want them to recognize that we're not going to be able to take back the countries with what we have. We need more ground forces. Now, another thing. Colin is not going to give you any support. He's for containment and waiting Saddam out. He isn't going to support additional troops that could give us an offensive capability. There are only 3 options. A, we attack up the middle, hey diddle diddle, in a penetration at a selected point, hope we can overwhelm the immediate forces, hold the shoulder, and get into the enemy's rear. B, we do an end run in an envelopment or double envelopment and get into his rear. And C, we do a frontal assault across the entire front, which we just don't have the forces to do. What those Washington armchair quarterbacks don't understand is you have to have a minimum of a 3-to-1 ratio in your force to take out a well-entrenched defender and preferably a 5-to-1 force. Now get out of here and enjoy DC and grab a large, fat, juicy steak and a couple of beers from me while you're at it," he finished with a wide grin of jealousy. "Sir, General Powell is on the line," the aide said. Schwarzkopf had just gotten in bed and was exhausted. "What time is it?" the general asked, barely able to contain his yawn. "It's 23:30, sir," the aide responded, holding out the receiver for him to grab. Sitting up, Schwarzkopf took the phone. "Colin, do you know what time it is here?" "Yeah, are you in bed already?" Powell asked, a hint of humor in his voice. "No, I was getting ready to go out to a dance tonight with the king. What do you want?" Another wide yawn escaped before he could stop it. "Well, the briefing just finished, and I wanted to go over it with you and give you an update." "That couldn't wait until morning? Okay, never mind. How'd it go? How did Johnson do?" "Oh, Johnson? He did great. Good call on sending him. The brief on the air campaign went very well. However, the brief on the ground campaign was horrible. General Johnson got a minute into it when the sharpshooters started in on him. All we were hearing was, 'Well, what about this?' And, 'Well, if you don't do this, how can you do that?' To Johnson's credit, he stood in there and took a lot of hits. That last slide you sent was ineffective. Everyone was already convinced that this ground plan couldn't work. Powell explained. Look, I've told you that we don't have a viable plan with the size force you've given me. A penetration is the only possible option, and with the 82nd and 121st locked up over in Jeddah, the chance of success is nil. We could punch through the Iraqi lines, but they'd have us boxed in and surrounded in the UAE. We could end up losing the whole thing. It would be a bloody disaster. Right now it appears we're able to hold our own should they look to invade. But if you people want us to move Saddam back to his own territory, then I need a larger force. Without it, I'm just whistling Dixie. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to get some sleep, Colin. We can talk in the morning if you'd like. Good night, Schwarzkopf said, and enjoyed a restful night of sleep. Mission accomplished. Chapter 17. Preparing for the Games. 8th October 1990. 101st Airborne HQ, Yanbu International Airport, Yanbu, Saudi Arabia. Okay, let's get started, Major General Benny Peters said as he walked into the briefing room. The Division HQ had taken over most of the airport and turned a few of the rooms into briefing rooms. The division had set up a base camp on the northeast side of the airport in the open desert. The division staff had taken up residence in the Haji tents permanently installed in front of the terminal building. What civilian air traffic came into the airport utilized the old terminal on the south side of the runway. Looking over the assembled officers, General Peters was confident in the division's ability to execute the mission. However, he knew some of these officers would not be present at the next briefing, especially some of the infantry battalion commanders once their units deployed to the field. Gentlemen, he said, the 2nd Iraqi Corps is on the move and heading this way, slowly, but they are coming. The Air Force is going to hit them with a B-52 strike to try and slow them up, but whatever survives that strike is going to be our responsibility to stop. This will not be an easy fight, but it's one I'm confident we will win. Okay, Colonel Cordray, let's hear the intel, Peters said as he took his seat. Sir, the enemy situation is as follows. He pointed at a map of the area of operations. The 2nd Iraqi Corps has 5 divisions, the 7th Infantry Division, the 37th Infantry Division, and the 51st Infantry Division are moving south. The 2nd Infantry Division is sitting in Tabuk, and the 14th Mechanized is limping back to Tabuk after getting the shit kicked out of it in the mountains southwest of Tabuk by the Navy A-6s. The 7th ID is located at Massadar with the main body and has pushed out reconnaissance elements as far south as Arar, located here. The 37th ID has moved south and is now located in the vicinity of Moghera and Fadia. The 51st ID is located south of Al-Jadid and is moving south. Of note, each of these divisions has been allocated additional tanks, but they're all experiencing a shortage of fuel. The fuel problem has become so severe it appears they've parked the additional tanks and aren't even using them for the time being. In addition, the BTR-70s they received appear to be suffering from maintenance issues. We've seen several maintenance yards with a higher than usual number of vehicles. In the past, these 3 divisions moved by truck, and the BTRs are new to their organization. We suspect that they haven't had enough time to be fully trained and proficient in maintaining them properly and repairing them quickly. Cordray paused, expecting some discussion. Bob, could they be parking their tanks just to have them in reserve and waiting until they come upon a need or better tank terrain? General Peters inquired. Sir, that is a possibility, but we believe it's more of a fuel issue. The 2nd Iraqi Corps has come a long way over some really tough terrain. They had few opportunities to take on fuel in their drive from Iraq to Tabuk. They were able to resupply at Tabuk, but they haven't had many places to get additional fuel from Tabuk to their present location, so their tankers are making long hauls to keep them supplied. To make matters worse, Tabuk is out of gas from what we're seeing, so they're having to go clear back to Iraq or Al-Jubail on the west coast to get fuel. The closest major gas station for them is Yanbu and the refinery there. Even the 51st Division, which is in good open tank country, has circled the wagons on their tanks and left them at Al-Jadid. Grunting at the assessment, Peters countered, So they're having a logistics nightmare, is what you're telling me, and it's across the entire Corps. Yes, sir. It appears they've prioritized fuel to their air defense systems, self-propelled and towed artillery, and their fleet of infantry BTRs. The tanks look to be a low priority for fuel, Colonel Cordray replied. Okay, was all General Peters said. Air defense for the 2nd Iraqi Corps has been upgraded. Normally we see 4 ZSU-23-4 and 4 SA-9 with each regiment. Now we're seeing double that number with each regiment and some SA-6 missiles being integrated as well. Although in this terrain their effectiveness will be limited, except in the area around the 51st Division, which is wide-open terrain, they're posing additional dangers for our helicopters and aircraft. They also have an abundance of SA-7s, and we believe it was an SA-7 that took out the little bird from the CAV unit the other day, Cordray said. Looking over at the CAV commander, Lieutenant Colonel Hawk Rowe, Cordray said, "Sorry for your loss, Hawk." Hawk just nodded in appreciation. Cordray turned back to General Peters. Terrain in the area of operations favors the defense as it's rugged and steep, channeling an attacker into narrow passes and impassable terrain for armor and vehicles, Cordray noted. As he spoke, an overlay of acetate was placed on the map, color-coded to indicate impassable terrain and roads. Wadis that could support vehicle movement were also highlighted. Sir, in the vicinity of Fadia, there's a road that initially appears to be going west, but in fact turns north and heads almost back to Tabuk and into some very nasty rugged terrain. They got their nose punched good a couple of weeks ago when the 14th Mechanized Division attempted to cut west through the mountains, and we hit them with multiple airstrikes, Cordray explained, expecting some discussion. When none came, he continued. From Fadia to Masadair is the main highway moving south. There are no exits off this road to the west. From Moghera, east of Fadia, there's no road to Masadair, but the terrain will support BTR-wheeled vehicles. However, when they reach the vicinity of Masadair, they have no avenue of approach and must come back to the road out of Masadair. From Masadair for 10 miles south, there's a narrow gorge that the highway passes through before coming out on a wide wadi. The wadi is 24 miles long and 6 miles wide at the widest point. The town of Abu Haramel is at the end of the wadi and appears to have a population of 1,500 to 2,000 inhabitants. Buildings are typical of Saudi Arabia. Concrete block, 1- and 2-story. There are 2 roads that go west from the town, but go into some very rough terrain. If they have local knowledge or recon elements, they may find a way to move through this area to the coast. From Abu Haramel to Jada'a, south for 40 miles, they'd have open ground to disperse their force and then move into the more restrictive terrain for the next 40 miles. That would take them into the flank of the 82nd, Colonel Cordray explained, stopping a few times to point out some of the terrain features and paths the Iraqi units could take on the big map. It helped to paint them a better image of the battle space they were fighting in. "Well, we can't let that happen now, can we, gentlemen?" General Peters said. "Okay, Bob. What about the 51st Division? How does it look for them?" "Sir, the 51st has open ground from Al-Jadid south for 50 miles. He can disperse his force over a wide area with easy movement cross-country. At that point, the terrain is going to start restricting him somewhat to the road for 11 miles before it opens up again. He will have some maneuver room for the next 19 miles before it starts closing up again. The ground is rocky, but BTRs should be able to cross it. Tanks definitely can cross it. His mobility will be impeded to some degree, but he'll have greater mobility than his compadres in the west," Cordray said. "So what you're saying is this guy, the 51st, may be the biggest threat because our infantry won't be as effective in this area as in the west," General Peters deduced. "Yes, sir. He's going to have a mobility advantage over our infantry in this area. But we may have a great opportunity here. We could hit him with our attack helicopters before he reaches the restrictive terrain, then have our infantry hit him from the hillsides while the birds rearm and refuel. When he gets to the next open area, we lift the infantry out and move them back to the next restrictive terrain, 20 miles south, while the birds go to work on him again, Colonel Cordray indicated. General Peters mulled that over for a minute. Okay, let's look at that as a possible course of action. Now, what about enemy air activity? Sir, it appears that our air is gaining parity with the Iraqi Air Force, and at times we may have air superiority but not complete as yet, Cordray replied. General Peters studied the map for a few minutes. Hawk, do your boys have eyes on this 51st bunch? Hawk Rowe had had his boys watching the advance elements for 2 days now. Yes, sir, we do. His lead elements are about 20 miles south of Al-Jadid, as of 2 hours ago. They're moving fairly slow. Turning to the G3, Colonel Eric Provost, Cordray said, Eric, let's see if we can get a B-52 strike on this unit when it reaches this open terrain north of Al-Eshash. If we can catch them in there with a strike, that ought to hold them up for a bit, Peters explained. Yes, sir. I'll get a request in right away, Colonel Provost said, and one of his battle captains was out of the room and heading to file a request. The B-52s were in a flight of 3 aircraft at 30,000 feet. They were accompanied by a flight of 12 F-18s that had met them over the Red Sea. They were part of the Saratoga battle group. 2 EA-6 electronic jamming aircraft were in the package as well. They were 20 minutes away from weapons release when they detected the first signs of trouble. Republican Guard SA-10 Battalion, Prince Mohammed bin Abdulaziz International Airport, Medina, Saudi Arabia. Major Vasily Ivanov moved to the sergeant's chair when the man raised his hand, indicating he needed to speak with a supervisor. As he approached the man's chair, he motioned for his Iraqi counterpart to join him. These people will never learn how to use this weapon properly if they do not pay attention and try to learn, Ivanov thought to himself. He was growing frustrated with the Iraqi officer's lack of initiative. He'd been told the soldiers in the Republican Guard were supposed to be better, but he was having a hard time telling the difference between them and the regular Army soldiers he'd been training for the last year. It looks like a major raid, Comrade Major, the sergeant declared. It sure does, Comrade. Ivanov turned to face his Iraqi counterpart, wanting to see if the man had learned anything up to this point. What do you see, Comrade Major? The Iraqi major didn't like to be referred to as comrade. He wasn't a godless communist. I see several groupings of aircraft. These smaller, more numerous objects appear to be fighters or escorts. These larger objects are likely bombers, the Iraqi major said. Good. He is paying attention, Major Vasily Ivanov was thinking before he asked. This small group of fighters, they appear to have broken off from the main force. They look to be heading towards us. Tell me, comrade, why are they doing this and what should we do about it? If I recall from our previous conversations, this group breaking off should either be Navy A-6 intruders, likely carrying AGM-88 HARM missiles, or they could be either F-4G Wild Weasel Phantoms or F-16 fighters equipped with the HARM targeting system, the Iraqi major replied, after studying the screen for a moment. Good. So these fighters are now 108 kilometers away and closing. The main group, likely the ones with the bombers, look to be 118 kilometers away. I believe we should have Battery A engage the fighters closing in on our radar, and then Battery B look to engage the bombers, the Iraqi major offered. Ivanov smiled. His weeks of lessons appeared to be taking root. Excellent, Major. What should we do with Battery C? Battery C we hold back in reserve to protect the airport and our main radars until Batteries A and B have had time to reload. Ivanov nodded in approval. And here I had feared you were not listening to me during training. Good job, Major. I should be able to sign off on your certification after this engagement. Would you like me to spend some time at any of the batteries before I return to Baghdad? Let's talk about that after we see the performance of the battery commanders from this first engagement. Ivanov watched as the Republican Guard officer then went into action, showing more signs of life now than he had the previous 4 weeks of training. He was issuing orders and making sure his people knew what to do. Maybe these Republican Guard soldiers really are the best soldiers the Iraqis have. 801st Bombardment Squadron, Saudi Arabia. Major Luke Duke, callsign Duke, was getting nervous. Beads of sweat were running down his face despite his best efforts to try to keep the cockpit cool. Their RWR was telling them a very powerful search radar was tracking them. That meant they were likely going to be targeted by some sort of high-altitude missile system. "What do you think, SA-2 or SA-5? Duke asked his electronic warfare officer below the flight deck. There was a momentary pause in response, causing Duke and his co-pilot, Captain Paul Pancake Haven, to get more nervous. Duke, I'm not sure it's either. The range on that search radar is huge. I think they may have moved an SA-10 to the Medina airport," Captain Tim Iggy Igor, his electronic warfare officer, or EWO, announced. "If they moved an SA-10 into the area, Duke, that could cause us some serious problems," Pancake declared. "Whoa, did one of you guys say those Iraqis may have an SA-10? How'd they get those?" one of the other crewmen said. "It doesn't matter. If they fire a missile at us, we'll just deal with it. In the meantime, we have a mission to do," Duke declared, as he sought to push his own fears down and reassure his crew. Their bomber droned on for another few minutes before the tone of their RWR changed to a more urgent one. A missile had locked onto them. "Yeah, that's an SA-10. No other missile has this kind of range," commented their EWO. "Can you jam it? What do you need me to do to help you?" Duke asked urgently, trying to hide the fear rising within him. They'd trained for penetration missions into the Soviet Union, and while training for something does help, it doesn't compare to having a giant missile fired at you from over 100 kilometers away, racing after you at a speed of 5,400 miles per hour. "Hang on, I'm trying. See if you can get a hold of the Raven flight. Their EW pods might come in real handy right now." Duke switched channels to connect him to the Raven flight. They had a flight of 2 EF-111 flying cover with them. The Sparkvarks weren't kitted out to carry bombs like the other Aardvarks. Instead, they carried the NALQ-99E airborne electronic warfare system tucked away in the bomb bay with the jamming pods mounted on the top of the rear vertical stabilizer and little nodules along the wings. A handful of minutes later, the single missile targeting them appeared to have lost its lock. Duke and his aircrew breathed a sigh of relief. They watched with bated breath, hoping no other bomber took a hit. Then they saw it. "Oh, Jesus! Conga's plane took a hit!" Pancake pointed to the stricken bomber. The missile looked like it had taken out 2 of their 8 engines. "Come on, dump your ordnance. Lighten the plane," Duke found himself whispering softly to himself. "He's dumping his bombs," Pancake finally announced. Stick after stick of 500-pound dumb bombs fell from the bomber. Pancake then pointed to something. "Oh, damn! There's another missile right there!" The missile had flown almost straight up and slammed into the bottom center of the lumbering bomber. Moments later, the entire thing exploded in the largest airburst any of them had ever seen. As they were taking in the scene, 5 of their F-18 escorts were also destroyed, unable to evade or throw off the deadly missiles. When the original missiles fired at the bombers lost their locks on the giant planes, their seeker head began scanning for the next best thing it could find. Unlike the B-52s, the Hornets didn't have a dedicated electronic warfare officer or advanced EW equipment built into their airframe. The bombers were built to penetrate Soviet airspace. They had a very strong EW capability of their own. Couple that with a Sparkvark, and they were hard to hit. "We're coming over the target. Keep it stable, Duke," called out their bombardier. A few minutes later, the 14 remaining bombers of the squadron released their sticks of bombs. Once they'd released their load, the bombers made a wide arc out of Saudi Arabia, heading closer to the Jordanian border, which kept them out of range of the SA-10 near Medina. Until the Air Force or Navy was able to suppress that system, this would likely be one of the last deep penetration missions they'd run for a little while. Chapter 18. Find the Scuds. 8 October 1990. ODA 5226, Intercontinental. Muscat, Oman. Sergeant First Class. Mike Weekly wasn't just tired, he was bone-tired. His body ached all over. He and his team had been conducting a recon along the Oman-Saudi border, observing the activities of the Iraqi forces in the vicinity of Al Ain. In a way, his team had it easy. They would go out on patrol for a few days, then return to this totally awesome hotel the embassy had set them up with months ago when they'd first arrived in-country. It was a far cry from the medieval fighting taking place out west, near Jeddah. Sitting in his hotel room at the Intercontinental along the coast, Weekly was excited about the arrival of Soxent headquarters. The advance party had arrived the day before and was finally settling in. With Soxent in theater, they'd finally have a buffer between them and General Yeosok. Sometimes big army and special forces didn't speak the same language. Additional SF elements were finally arriving in theater, which hopefully meant his ODA would start to receive some better, more SF-specific missions. Playing recon games along the border was a big misuse of their skills. "Hey, Weekly, are you in there?" Staff Sergeant Donovan asked while knocking on the door. "Yeah, now go away," Weekly responded, not wanting to leave his bed. "The LT wants us downstairs for a briefing in 10 minutes. I was told to come and get you," his friend replied. "Okay, I'll be right down," Weekly said as he rolled out of bed and headed to the shower. He was feeling the past month in his bones. "I'm getting too old for this stuff," he thought, as the hot water ran down his back and shoulders. Weekly was 32 and had risen quickly through the ranks. Joining the army at 17 to be an infantry soldier, he had excelled in basic and advanced individual training, earning a slot to airborne school. Upon graduation, he'd been approached by a Special Forces recruiter. The recruiter hadn't begged him to join Special Forces. Instead, he'd offered him a challenge like no other. Knowing these kinds of offers didn't come very often, not in the 1980s, he couldn't turn it down and accept it on the spot. For him, the problem wasn't the physical endurance, but the classroom and bookwork. Language school was a real challenge considering he had a hard enough time with English. One thing he'd quickly learned in Special Forces was that it left little time for a home life or a love life. You were constantly training or deploying, which to a young single guy was cool. But as you got up there in years, you started to want those things you saw your siblings and families having. Hell, at 32, he only needed 5 more years until he was eligible for retirement and having the safety net of that pension. It wasn't enough to live on unless you had low expectations. Still, it was enough to make life with a second career very comfortable. Drying off, he got into his uniform and headed out the door. Standing in the elevator, he was already salivating at the thought of grabbing a fresh cup of joe. The hotel had incredible coffee, ready for them at nearly all hours of the day, whenever they needed it. In the past 3 weeks, the hotel had been taken over by Special Operations Command, Central. The Special Forces Command had been given carte blanche by the government of Oman to billet their personnel out of and conduct their briefings from the hotel. No other guests were able to stay at the hotel, as it had been completely rented out by Soxent. In the span of a week, the command had the entire place up and running as a fully operational military base, funded and paid for by the King of Saudi Arabia, who was seeing to every need of these brave warriors sent to liberate their kingdom. All the soldiers had to do was order something from the menu, or have it sent to their room, and it was paid for. Even the bar did a good business, despite Schwarzkopf ordering no alcohol for the troops in theater. When the elevator dinged and opened, Weekly stopped in the lobby only long enough to grab a fresh cup of coffee and a Danish that had been placed next to the coffee. Moving down the hall to one of the rooms designated for his unit, he put the Danish in his mouth and held it with his teeth so he could open the door. "Ah, there you are, Sergeant. Glad to see you could make it," Lieutenant Harris said as he pointed to an empty seat. It looked like the others had been specifically waiting on him, which made him feel kind of bad for not having rushed a bit more to get down here. "Now that you're here, we'll get started." There was a major seated next to Lieutenant Harris. He hadn't seen this person before, which made him wonder what was going on. "Sir," Harris announced, letting the major know they were all here and accounted for. Standing in front of the operators, Major Reynolds cleared his throat as he began. "Gentlemen, your team hammered the hell out of the 1st Hammurabi Armored Division last month. I mean, you guys thoroughly slayed names and stacked bodies. In light of that, we have a unique, special mission that's perfectly suited just for you. As a matter of fact, it'll give you guys a fresh chance to sneak around inside Saddam's backyard again." As Major Reynolds spoke, he pointed to a map of the UAE. "Here's the port of Sakur on the Persian Gulf. 2 weeks ago, a ship arrived and offloaded what we believe to be 4 Scud-D systems, given what we're seeing in the aerial reconnaissance photos." He showed them some images of the Scud launchers and some of the support vehicles parked near the freighters. "During the dead of night, and with some cloud cover obscuring our satellites, they disappeared. We believe they may have been moved to this area due east of the port in these mountains, and specifically in this wadi. That places them in range of every military installation in Muscat. I don't have to tell you how big of a threat it would be to start having Scud missiles raining down on CENTCOM HQ, our little pad here, or the airport." "Damn, Haas, you aren't joking. In Afghanistan between March and June 1989, 3 Afghan firing batteries fired some 400 missiles in support of some of their garrisons under attack. They used these Scuds extensively last year and into the start of this," one of the senior NCOs said. He'd spent some time working in Afghanistan as an advisor to the Mujahideen fighters. "Exactly. That's why your new mission is to insert into this area and find them. When you do, you will contact us, and we'll send an airstrike your way to take them out. Any questions?" "Sir, how do you see us being inserted? Helicopter's going to make a lot of noise in those mountains, and it's too far to walk with our gear," Lieutenant Harris asked. In his heart, he already knew the answer. "You'll be conducting a HAHO parachute insertion. A C-130 will parallel the border at 30,000 feet. As soon as you exit, activate your chutes and navigate to a point here. We've calculated your rate of descent and will drop you in favorable winds to move you along," Major Reynolds explained. The team had practiced high altitude, high open drops at night, but this was a first for them in combat. Anxiety levels just went up a notch. "And for the extraction, sir?" Weakly pressed. "Helicopter noise for the extraction won't be a problem, so we'll come for you with aircraft from Task Force 160th, Major Reynolds responded. The team had frequently worked with the famed Night Stalkers. They were hands down the best night-flying pilots around. "The aircraft will also have 2 other teams on board who will be jumping at points along the flight path. Once you leave the aircraft, you will not have contact with them as they're landing at other points to do the same as you. Find the Scud launchers. If you find a launcher and can destroy it yourselves, do it. If not, call in an airstrike before they can move it again. Scud missiles are important, but without the launchers, what good are they? We want the launchers destroyed." 30,000 feet above the desert. First Lieutenant Harris looked at his team with satisfaction. With a couple of missions now under his belt, he felt a lot more confident leading his team. He'd leaned on Sergeant First Class weakly at the outset, but steadily he was taking more initiative. Heck, in a week, he pinned on Captain, so he better start feeling more confident about leading them. 6 minutes, the C-130 loadmaster yelled. The warning caused Harris to snap out of his private thoughts and return to the present. One of the Air Force crewmen who flew exclusive Special Forces missions walked over to the row of seats Harris's team was situated on and shouted loudly, Stand up." The soldiers climbed out of the webbed seats, struggling a bit with their parachutes and all their necessary equipment strapped to their bodies as they did. "Check equipment," came the next command. Each of the operators went to work, their muscle memory taking over as they went through the process of checking and rechecking the equipment of the man in front of them. In addition to their parachutes, each operator had his weapon, rucksack, load-bearing equipment, oxygen bottle and mask, a double combat load of ammunition, and enough food and water for a week. It was a lot of equipment to travel with, but it meant they could go at least a week without needing a resupply. At this altitude, it was necessary for them to carry a small oxygen bottle and mask. Inside the pressurized C-130, they breathed normally. However, when the doors opened, they went on the oxygen bottles. Once they dropped to 10,000 feet, they'd be able to breathe normally again, and removed the masks. The advantage of jumping and then deploying your parachute from this altitude was your ability to glide across long distances without being detected. One new piece of equipment they'd recently added to their inventory was the small Garmin handheld GPS receiver. This would help them navigate during their glide phase and make sure they landed at or near their intended landing point. These devices were so new to the military, they were being purchased directly from the manufacturers for the Special Forces units. Calculating the exit point, Harris figured they would be able to glide approximately 17 miles to a touchdown point. If the Iraqis had radars tracking the aircraft, they certainly wouldn't track them. The men and their parachutes were too small of a return to show up on the kind of radars they were using. Even if they did, they would appear no larger than birds. As they finished their final checks of themselves and each other, the sound of the ramp being lowered caused all eyes to turn to the rear of the aircraft. No matter how many of these ha-ho jumps one did, the view was always the same. Tonight was no different. It was dark behind the plane, the full moon illuminating some of the ground below, but leaving the canyons and valleys pitch black in some of the more remote areas. The full moon would make for a nice jump, and as the area was uninhabited, there was little chance they'd be spotted. Walking towards the ramp as they finished their final checks, Harris and Weekly stood side by side at the edge of the ramp. When the green light came on, they both leaned forward and dropped from sight. They were quickly followed by the rest of the team. Within seconds, each jumper was stable and activated his square canopy chute and turned to the heading that would lead them to their intended touchdown point, 17 miles away. They floated for what felt like an eternity. The trip down did give them a good view of everything about them. For the most part, the ground below was black. However, they did spot a couple clusters of lights. Not a lot of lights, maybe just a handful. Some would flicker off only to flicker on again. This became a lot more noticeable as approached the ground. Still, they looked to be miles from their drop zone. The lights likely meant there was an army unit there, or maybe a Bedouin encampment. It'd be worth investigating later, Harris thought privately. Approaching the ground, they were even more pleased to see it was bathed in moonlight. This made spotting any possible obstacles a hell of a lot easier. The last thing they needed at this point was a twisted ankle. Or worse, as each member neared the ground, they dropped their rucksacks and applied the brakes to the parachute, causing them to all make stand-up landings and quickly collapse their chutes. No tucking and rolling on these landings, at least not if you did it right. Although the ground was perfect for the landings, it was hard, compact ground, almost as hard as concrete. Once on the ground, Harris attempted to dig a hole to put the parachutes in. Sad waste of a new parachute at the cost of $1,000 each, he thought. He quickly realized that this was not going to work, as the ground was too hard for their small entrenching tools. He waved his hands to get his second-in-command's attention. "Weekly," Harris said in a loud whisper, getting the senior non-commissioned officer to look at him. "Sir," Weekly responded in a low voice. At night in the desert, sound traveled easily, See if you can find some soft area to bury the chutes. We'll be here all night if we keep trying to bury them in this soil. While Weekly tried to figure out a better way for them to hide their chutes, Staff Sergeant Donovan established comms with Sawcent and gave them a status report. The team landed in a large wadi that flowed from the Oman UAE border north to the Persian Gulf and the port of Sakr. Their touchdown was only 5 miles from the port area. Between them and the port was a retention basin that captured water runoff from 2 large wadis. The other team jumping with them landed in another wadi to the south of their location. Between the 2 of them, they'd be able to scour the area near the mountains along the Oman UAE border. After an hour, the chutes were finally buried, and the team struck off to the north. Because of the large retention lake, which pretty much blocked the entrance to the wadi, they weren't too worried about anyone driving up the wadi towards them. On the other side, however, they would have to move carefully. Weekly, the first order of business is to find a hide position that we can operate out of and observe the approaches, Lieutenant Harris said. Weekly, being the most experienced of the 2, knew this but felt that Lieutenant Harris was looking for confirmation of his decision rather than giving instructions. You got it, sir. Weekly pulled out his map. In the bright moonlight, it wasn't necessary to turn on a flashlight. While they took a moment to study the map, the remainder of the team set up a 360-degree perimeter around them, with each member kneeling and looking outward for any sign of an approaching threat. Weekly noticed some key features that he began pointing out to the officer. Sir, we have 2 good ridges on both sides of the retention pond, but I think we would have a better view from this one south of the wadi. We could set up a hide position on this forward slope in some of these crevices, he explained, as his finger traced the areas he was talking about. Yeah, but we have to pass by this town to get there, and the damn dogs will start raising hell as we approach, Harris acknowledged. Yes, sir, but we'll have that same problem on this northern ridge as well. Worse, we won't have nearly as good a view of the area as we would from the southern ridge, was Weekly's gentle reply. Yeah, you may be right, Harris finally acknowledged, as he continued to study the map and looked towards both ridgelines. He knew a decision was necessary and quick, as daylight was only 6 hours away. They didn't want to be caught climbing the ridges in daylight. Although the UAE was overrun by the Iraqis, there might be sympathizers that would love to turn his team in for any rewards that were being offered. Okay, we'll head to the southern ridge and set up there. And for God's sake, let's be as quiet as possible going past this town. I don't want us to wake up every damn dog in the place, Harris said as he rose to his feet. The soldiers manning the perimeter stood when they saw their leaders stand. They were ready to move. They just needed to be pointed in the right direction. Once everyone was up and had adjusted their loads, Harris whispered, Okay, let's move out. Justin, you take point. From where they landed, they had to move a click and a half to get to the base of the ridge. The climb to the top was another click. Once on the flat ground, they'd cover the distance to the hide site rather quickly, but the steep climb at the end was going to tax their physical endurance, especially getting to the top before sunrise.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.